All right, today we're going to take a journey through the story of Indian labor law. Now, this isn't just about old dusty laws. This is a story about a constant, ongoing struggle for something really fundamental: dignity at work. So, let's get into it.
So, let me ask you something right off the bat. Are you an employee? It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But honestly, in the eyes of the law, this might be the single most important question. Why? Because your rights, your protections, pretty much your entire legal standing, it all hinges on the answer. Okay, so here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to start with the absolute foundation, the employment contract. Then, we'll jump in a time machine and go way back to the master-servant era. From there, we'll see how workers began to fight for their rights, which led to what many call the Golden Age. And finally, we'll bring it to the present day to look at our new economy and try to peek into the future of work.
All right, Section 1. Any real talk about your rights as a worker has to start right here, with the employment contract. Think of it as the foundation of a house. Without it, nothing else can stand. It's the legal bedrock for everything.
So what is it really? Well, at its core, it's a legal deal with three main ingredients. 1, you agree to do work for someone else. 2, you get paid for it. And 3, and this one is super important, the other person has a degree of control over how you do that work.
So, how do the courts decide if you're really an employee? Well, they often use a kind of checklist, sometimes called the 4 pillars. Who has the power to hire you? Who's responsible for your paycheck? Who tells you not just what to do, but how to do it? And finally, who has the power to fire you? If you can tick all those boxes, you're almost certainly looking at an employment contract.
But here's a crucial point, a real heads up. The law doesn't just automatically assume you're an employee. Nope. If you want all the protections that come with that status, the responsibility, the legal burden of proof is on you to show that the relationship exists.
Okay, now let's hop in that time machine. Because to really understand the rights we have today, you have to see what things were like when there were, well, basically no rights at all. Welcome to the era of the master-servant relationship.
I mean, the difference is just night and day. Back then, exploitation wasn't just common, it was the norm. And get this, if a worker just decided to quit their job, it wasn't a simple disagreement. It could be treated as a criminal offense. The power was completely 100% stacked on one side. And this wasn't some informal rule, It was written down, black and white, in the law. An actual act from 1860 explicitly said that if a worker broke their contract, it was a crime. Just think about that for a second. That one single law tells you everything you need to know about how lopsided things really were. But you can only push people so far for so long. And eventually, things started to shift. In the early 20th century, a powerful new force emerged, the trade union movement. This was the moment workers realized, hey, maybe we're stronger together, and they started to organize, to demand, and to fight for their rights. And you can really see the momentum building right here on this timeline. First, in 1919, the International Labor Organization is created, setting a global standard. Then, and this is huge for India, the Trade Unions Act is passed in 1926. After that, influential reports start coming out, and then bam, the Minimum Wages Act. The seeds of change were being planted, and they were starting to grow. But I want to be crystal clear. This was not an easy fight. It was genuinely risky. Take the story of B.P. Wadia, an early union leader. He helps organize workers in a protest. And what happens? He gets held personally liable. The charge? Conspiracy to breach the contract. Because remember that old law? Organizing a strike was seen as a crime. He was actually forced to leave the movement. His story just shows you the incredible courage it took to stand up back then. And that is exactly why the Trade Unions Act of 1926 was so revolutionary. It was a complete game changer. What it did was create a legal shield. By registering your union, it became its own legal entity. And, this is the most important part, its leaders, unlike B.P. Wadia, were now protected from civil lawsuits just for doing things like organizing a strike. This was everything. So all this momentum builds, and then, in the decades after India's independence, it just explodes. We enter a period from about 1951 to 1991 that historians now call the Golden Age of Labor. This was a time when the entire system, the government, the courts, took a very clear pro-worker stance. So what did this golden age actually look like?
Well, for one, workers had a lot more bargaining power. The government's own big economic plans were focused on empowering labor. But maybe the biggest factor of all was the Indian judiciary, which consistently handed down these landmark judgments that just blew the doors open for worker rights. And at the very heart of all this was the Constitution of India itself. Article 23, for example, flat out prohibits something called bagar, which is basically forced or bonded labor. It acted as this powerful constitutional shield for the most vulnerable people in the country. Now, this is where things get truly wild. The Supreme Court took that idea of forced labor and did something incredible with it. In a landmark case, they said, you know what? Forced labor isn't just about someone physically chaining you to your work. They ruled that if an employer fails to pay an adequate minimum wage, that in and of itself is a form of forced labor. Wow, this was a radical expansion of worker protection, rooted right in the Constitution.
But, stories never stand still. And in 1991, the plot takes a major turn. India opens up its economy to the world. We're talking globalization, foreign investment, a whole new ballgame. This era of liberalization brought with it a totally new set of rules and a ton of new challenges for labor. And this basically set up the central conflict that we're still living in today. It's like a giant tug of war. On one side, you have the push to attract foreign investment and keep costs low to compete globally. On the other side, you have the decades of hard-won worker protections. And these two forces are in constant tension with each other. This tension has created a lot of, ambiguity, especially with the rise of the gig economy. The old definitions just don't always fit. I mean, if your boss is an algorithm on your phone and you work out of your own car, what are you? Who, legally speaking, is a worker anymore? Courts all over the world are struggling with this. In a very famous case from the UK involving Uber, the Supreme Court basically said, let's look past the contract and at the reality of the situation. They decided the key factors were subordination and dependency. Since the drivers were dependent on Uber for their income and subordinate to its control, they were workers. And that meant they were entitled to basic rights, like a minimum wage. Which brings us right up to today, where the picture is just so much more complex. We've moved way beyond that simple master and servant dynamic. To even begin to think about the future, we have to understand all the different players involved now. You see, it's not a two-way street anymore. It's more like a chaotic four-way intersection. You still have the employer and the employee, but now you also have this massive, growing category of contractors and gig workers. And who's directing traffic? The state, the government, acting as the regulator, sometimes waving business through, sometimes waving labor through. It's a really complex matrix. So, we end up right back where we started, with a question. We've seen this incredible journey, this constant shift in the balance of power. But right now, today, in a world of apps and algorithms and global supply chains, who truly holds the power? Is it the platform, the individual worker, or the state that sets the rules? That is the great unanswered question for the future of labor law.